Welcome to Spot Check, the weekly video update series for The Greatest Unreality, a dissertation about Dungeons & Dragons. I'm Nick Miser, now featuring 10% less facial hair. So this week we're going to be talking about assumptions about story in D&D, how those shape the dynamics of play, and what tensions have resulted as a result of differing assumptions about how story works in the game. But first, a quick update about the Kickstarter. We're at 7 days left, and we're sitting around 61%. We've got a ways to go, but it's very doable. We're building up some momentum over the past few days. If you haven't followed the Kickstarter, there's been exciting news. Adventurer Conqueror King, an old-school role-playing game system, is now available through the Kickstarter, so you can support games research and get an awesome old-school role-playing game. There's also Habitation of the Stone Giant Lord, which is an awesome collection of old modules handwritten from the 80s that Plagmata, the player-generated map and document archive, has put together, and they're also graciously making that available through the Kickstarter. So be sure to continue sharing the links. I really depend on the support of my backers, obviously, to continue spreading the news, and let me just take a moment also to again say I'm so grateful for everyone who has decided to back the project already, and for those who have continued to share links and tell their friends about it. So last week we talked about some of the dangers of storytelling and how early pulp authors like H.P. Lovecraft kind of dodged some of the dangers of the literary process by turning it into a game where they ceded some of the control over what would happen in the world to other people that were also writing in that same world. And this eventually leads to Dungeons & Dragons when combined with some other things. I'm going to skip over that history for today. We might come back to it. But I want to look at Dungeons & Dragons now and see how that plays out in the context of the game. When we're looking at the pulp authors, the power distribution. Now, power is something that anthropologists look at a lot, who's in control of defining situations and so on and so forth. The power in the early pulp fiction games was pretty much evenly spread because everyone was writing their stories independently of each other. In Dungeons & Dragons, of course, the power is a little bit unevenly spread out. The Dungeon Master has the initial formulation of the game world in most cases. They have the primary responsibility for preparing the adventure, and even over the course of the night, it's kind of generally considered their prerogative to control the pacing of the event. This can lead to some tensions, just like any power dynamic in any power system. And one of those things, and a lot of what I'm talking about today, comes from a conversation I had a few years ago, an interview with Tavis Allison. So I'm going to be referring to Tavis. You can check out his blog over at The Mule Abides. But when I say Tavis for the rest of the time, that's who I'm talking about. So Tavis pointed out that the role of the Dungeon Master is simultaneously important and subservient. Everyone's giving you all of their attention, but your control is only dependent on the attention that they're giving to you. And for some people, it gets tied up into a sense of self-worth even, and so that their worth in the session is only tied into the attention given to them. And this can lead to what we talk about as DM fatigue or burnout, when the Dungeon Master is putting in all of this effort in defining the world, and they don't feel like they're getting the engagement from the players that they want. And there's other kinds of dysfunctional things that can come out of this, where the players don't feel like they have the control that they want over the narrative. And so these tensions develop in Dungeons & Dragons because of these power dynamics that are built in. And there's lots of different responses that people have had to that. One example would be what's variously called the story game movement or indie games, where they've tried to kind of deconstruct some of those basic assumptions built into Dungeons & Dragons. And that's certainly one way that people have found to move forward and kind of reimagine how that gaming of the narrative process can look. Today, and through most of my research, I'm focusing on how the old school Renaissance has dealt with some of those issues. And what you see in the old school Renaissance is kind of going back to the earliest days of gaming and trying to reconsider some of the assumptions that we've made about what that gaming was like. And one of those is to go back and consider what we mean when we talk about story. In the quotation from Tavis that I opened the session with, Tavis talks about the story for him, and he's referring to when he was a kid playing in the 80s, was the actions that happened to his character, just the vivid events of play that he could remember. I found a magic arrow, I shot an orc with it, the orc died. I remembered that was part of the story of his character. And what we see is that in a lot of these early gaming scenarios, the emphasis is on direct human action, or demi-human action in some cases, rather than on kind of long, elaborate plot arcs like you learn about in English class with the rising action and climax and everything. And also not a focus on this strong, detailed characterization that we associate with literariness. And this ties into a few different things. It ties into the pulp origins of Dungeons and Dragons, where stories were more focused on modularity in their short story form, and there were more action-oriented short sequences that rather than a long plot arc like you find in quest fantasy that became more popular later. In anthropology, we can actually say that there are some similarities between that style of story and what we see in oral storytelling. Now, any distinction that we make when we're looking at humans is going to fall down on a number of points, and sometimes they're almost as harmful as they are helpful. But just to think with for a moment, there was an anthropologist named Walter Ong, who was a student of Marshall McLuhan, and he made a distinction between oral cultures and typographic cultures. And again, that breaks down on some levels, but there are some trends that he noticed that are worth looking at. One of the things that Ong found was that if you look at oral storytelling in non-typographic cultures, that the stories tend to involve things that are, he called them, close to the human life world. As Tavis said, he said, we're playing in situations I can understand. You know, I shot it with my arrow. And there's a lot of similarities between that oral storytelling form and what we find in early stories about gaming. And that shouldn't be surprising because it is oral storytelling. Now, in the 80s and 90s, quest fantasy became more and more popular. And that meant long series with detailed plot arcs. Now, of course, Lord of the Rings, it was around before that, but a lot of our best evidence says that the pulp fiction was a stronger influence on Gygax and Arneson when they first started creating Dungeons and Dragons, and that the quest fantasy, including Lord of the Rings, became increasingly important later on. And so in quest fantasy, you need that long plot arc, and you can't really achieve that using some of the same methods that were going on in early D&D. And so what we see is a change in assumption in how story should work in the game, or what story even was, and tied with that is that there are all sorts of changes that push out to the way that the game works and what people are expecting out of the game. And that brings me right up to the edge of talking about Dragonlance, and I will have to push that back to next week, but we've covered some of the ground of how you can see that changing ideas about story are going to precipitate different kinds of changes in what people expect out of the game and how they want to play the game. That wraps it up for this week. As always, I appreciate you listening. Be sure to keep sharing links to the Kickstarter and the YouTube video. I'll see you all next week.